Welcome to the deep dive. We're really glad you're joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thrilled to be here.
Look, if you have glanced at a news feed on your phone anytime recently, you know exactly how it feels. It's just an absolute unrelenting barrage.
Oh, it's totally overwhelming.
Right. You scroll through these headlines about shifting global alliances or sudden economic standoffs, major international institutions seemingly just freezing up. And you want to stay well informed, but dodging the daily info overload.
It's a full-time job.
It's practically a full-time job. Trying to make sense of all these disparate data points is exhausting. So that is exactly what we're going to tackle today.
And we have some really incredible material to get into.
We do. We're looking at a stack of incredibly timely sources. We've got academic excerpts, analytical notes, and contemporary commentary, all focused on the early 2026 lectures of Professor Noah Zerbe.
Specifically, his work on what he calls the architecture of the multiplex world order.
Yes. And our mission for this deep dive is straightforward, even if the topic itself is, massive. We want to figure out if the seeming global chaos you see on your timeline every single day is actually a total breakdown of the world as we know it.
Or if it's actually a highly structured transition into a brand new type of world.
Exactly.
And the stakes for understanding this really couldn't be higher for anyone trying to navigate today's reality.
Yeah.
I mean, traditional models of international relations are fundamentally failing to explain current events.
They just don't fit anymore.
They don't. The old frameworks simply do not fit the reality we are seeing on the ground right now. We keep trying to force 2026 problems into a 1990s mold, and it just doesn't work.
It's like trying to play chess with checkers rules.
Right. What Zerbe's framework offers is a completely fresh lens to look at the globe. It's a provocative lens, certainly, but it challenges that default underlying assumption that the sky is falling.
Yeah.
Instead, it suggests that the architecture of global power is just being radically remodeled while we are all still living inside the house.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really understand where Zerbe is coming from, we have to look at his core philosophy. In the source notes, it mentions his work is deeply rooted in something called the English School of International Relations.
Which sounds very formal.
It does. To me, that sounds like a dreary, wood-paneled boarding school, which probably isn't what he means. There's also this recurring phrase in the notes, the paradox of order without government, and the idea of an anarchical society.
Right, which sounds like an oxymoron.
It really does. When you hear the word anarchy, you instantly picture a dystopian wasteland. Total Mad Max rules, cars on fire. What exactly is Zerbe getting at here? Is this chaos actually a structured transition?
It's a great question. It is a counterintuitive phrase, but it's a fascinating concept once you strip away the cinematic imagery. In international relations, an anarchical society doesn't mean chaos or a post-apocalyptic wasteland. It simply means a society of states that do not have a supreme global ruler. There is no single world government dictating every country's move, no global police force that can unilaterally arrest a rogue nation.
No one is officially in charge.
Exactly. Yet, despite this lack of a central authority, the world doesn't instantly descend into a free-for-all. Instead, these states rely on shared norms, highly complex diplomacy, and international law to keep things functioning. They form a society.
So it's basically a neighborhood association, but with nuclear weapons and trade embargoes instead of passive-aggressive notes about lawn care.
That is a very apt, if slightly terrifying way to put it.
But if that's the baseline, I noticed something else in the sources that seems to complicate things. Zerbe doesn't just stick to traditional metrics of power. He incorporates what the notes call critical theory.
Yes, he pulls from several different frameworks.
Right, pulling from Marxism, post-colonialism, and feminism to analyze the situation. And as someone reading these notes, that sounds like a heavy academic load. What is he actually doing with these specific lenses?
He's using them to ask a really uncomfortable but crucial question about the past 80 years. Traditional thinkers, who we often call realists, tend to only look at hard state power. Who has the biggest military? Who has the highest GDP?
A classic scoreboard.
Exactly. But Zerbe argues that's insufficient for understanding our current transition. By bringing in lenses like post-colonialism, he's deconstructing what we call the liberal international order, the system built by the West after World War II.
The LIO.
Yes, the LIO. He's asking a deeply impartial analytical question here. Was this liberal international order ever truly stable for everyone? Or was it just a temporary setup that happened to greatly benefit the West?
Man, that is a massive paradigm shift. Instead of assuming the system was perfect and is now breaking, he's asking if it was ever actually working for the majority of the planet in the first place.
Precisely. If you use a critical lens, you start to ask, did this world order actually create universal peace? Or did it just export the friction and violence to the global south so the West could enjoy stability and economic growth?
And we should be clear, we are not saying that is definitively right or wrong.
No, absolutely not. We're entirely neutral on that. But as an analytical tool, it forces us to evaluate the past 8 decades from a completely different vantage point.
It changes the whole narrative.
It really does. Because if the global system was built primarily to favor a specific group of nations, its current unraveling might look like an absolute disaster to those legacy powers. But
It might look like a necessary, overdue correction to everyone else on the outside looking in.
exactly.
So if the old order primarily served the West, who is actually steering this transition right now, because looking at Zerbe's map in these 2026 lectures, it is so refreshing to see a geopolitical view that isn't just exclusively centered on Washington, D.C. or Beijing.
It's a totally different map.
For so long, the geopolitical narrative has treated the rest of the world as a passive chessboard where a handful of superpowers make all the moves. But Zerbe shifts the focus aggressively toward the global south.
He centers them completely. And he uses the concept of multi-alignment to explain their current behavior. This is a massive departure from the old Cold War days.
How so?
Well, back then, you had the non-aligned movement, where countries in the global south essentially tried to sit on the sidelines. They tried to be passive observers to avoid getting crushed between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Right. Just keep your head down.
Exactly. Today, however, the BRICS plus bloc and Zerbe specifically highlights India, Brazil, and South Africa. They are completely active players. They are not waiting on the sidelines, and they are certainly not waiting to be told what to do by traditional legacy powers.
The notes had a really interesting way of framing this, and it made me think of a professional sports league.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Think about it this way. The big superpowers are the legacy franchises who expect everyone to just play by their traditional rules. And for decades, smaller nations had to sign exclusive contracts with one of these legacy teams. You were either firmly on Team West or firmly on Team East.
You couldn't play for both.
Exactly. But now, nations like India, Brazil, and South Africa are acting like superstar free agents who outright refuse to sign exclusive contracts.
They're writing their own tickets.
They really are.
Yeah.
They will sign a massive defense and technology deal with the West on Monday, pivot and sign a crucial infrastructure agreement with China on Wednesday, and then secure a vital energy and fertilizer contract with Russia on Friday.
They are actively balancing all these powers against each other to maximize their own national interests. They are playing the field.
And if you apply that multi-alignment model to the real world today, it completely changes how you consume your daily news, doesn't it?
It really does. I want you, the listener, to think about the outdated Cold War mentality that still dominates so much of our media cycle. That rigid idea that the world is strictly divided into two opposing zero-sum camps.
Us versus them.
Right. But if you drop that old map and pick up Zerbe's multi-alignment map, suddenly the actions of the Global South do not look confusing, erratic, or contradictory at all. They look incredibly strategic.
Right. So if India buys Russian oil while simultaneously conducting joint military exercises with the United States,
It isn't a betrayal of one side. It is a textbook multi-aligned move. It provides a far more accurate map of the 2026 reality.
which brings us to the biggest concept in today's deep dive, the one that ties all of this together. The idea of the multiplex world.
Welcome to the multiplex.
Exactly. Zerbe argues that we are moving away from a unipolar world where one superpower calls all the shots, but we are not just falling into total chaos, we are entering a multiplex system.
So think of a giant, bustling movie theater.
Right, there are multiple centers of power, multiple screens playing completely different movies at the exact same time, and absolutely no single manager running the whole show.
What's fascinating here is that this multiplex concept provides a crucial, grounded middle ground. On one extreme of the public discourse, you have the new Cold War narrative, which is overly simplistic and tries to force everything into a binary.
And then on the other extreme,
On the other extreme, you have the fear of total global anarchy, which is overly pessimistic and assumes the end of all international cooperation. The multiplex theory accounts for the sheer, messy complexity of our current decade.
it really fits the data better.
It does. A key detail from our source notes highlights this brilliantly. In this multiplex world, issues like global trade, climate change mitigation, and national security are all following entirely different rule books.
Right, so to stick with the theater analogy, you could have two nations locked in a fierce, zero-sum security conflict in Theater 1, an action movie with really high stakes.
Right.
But right next door, in Theater 2, those exact same two nations are actively cooperating on green energy initiatives or global health protocols because the climate rulebook demands collaboration. It's a documentary, and they have to work together.
Exactly that dynamic.
Yeah.
They are competing fiercely in one arena while cooperating deeply in another simultaneously.
Okay, I have to step in and play devil's advocate here because as I was reading this, I kept thinking about the critics' view. Isn't a multiplex world inherently unstable?
It's a fair point.
If there is no single global policeman to enforce the rules across all these theaters, won't the system inevitably descend into the exact chaos that Zerbe is trying to explain away? I mean, if everyone is playing by different rulebooks simultaneously, it sounds like an administrative nightmare. It sounds like a room full of dry tinder just waiting for a spark.
It is a totally valid critique,
Yeah.
and it is something that impacts you directly as a listener. Think about your daily life and the items you rely on.
Okay.
A multiplex world means the supply chains for the smartphone in your pocket, the microchips in your car, or the coffee on your breakfast table are no longer secured by a single overarching global agreement.
They're fragmented.
Highly fragmented. They're dictated by overlapping, sometimes deeply conflicting global spheres of influence. Your technology might rely on a fragile security agreement in the Indo-Pacific, while your food supply relies on a totally separate climate and trade agreement in South America.
And if one of those spheres breaks,
If one of those overlapping spheres breaks down, the shockwaves hit your daily life much faster because there isn't a single global hegemon with the economic or military muscle to swoop in and instantly stabilize the market. The buffer is gone.
and to prove why this multiplex is replacing the old system, Zerbe goes right after one of the most famous political theories of the modern era. He explicitly challenges Francis Fukuyama's concept of the end of history.
Yes.
For anyone who doesn't remember the sheer optimism of the 1990s, Fukuyama basically argued that with the fall of the Soviet Union, the ideological battle was over. Liberal democracy and free market capitalism were the final destination of human political evolution.
We had reached the finish line.
Exactly. The West had won, and the rest of the globe would inevitably just adopt that model.
The optimism of the 1990s feels very, very distant from the vantage point of 2026.
It really does.
Zerbe traces a very specific, deliberate timeline of unraveling to show how Western institutional gridlock has systematically dismantled that end-of-history narrative. He doesn't just point to one event, he shows a cascade.
Right. The sources point to the 2008 global financial crash as the first major crack, breaking the core promise of inevitable, stable economic prosperity.
Then you add the COVID-19 pandemic on top of that.
Oh, exactly.
The pandemic exposed severe, fatal vulnerabilities and gross inequities in global supply chains and public health cooperation. It showed that when a crisis hits, countries will hoard resources rather than cooperate.
And then the wars.
Right. Following that, the return of major traditional ground wars, what we call kinetic wars, specifically the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza, laid bare the profound limitations of Western diplomatic and security architectures.
The institutions designed to prevent or swiftly resolve major wars proved incapable of doing so.
Yes.
What I love about diving into this material is how grounded Zerbe's analysis actually is when looking at these failures. When we talk about global power, it is so easy to fall into the trap of just counting aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, and nuclear warheads.
The traditional metrics.
Right. But Zerbe looks at entirely different metrics to map this multiplex. He looks closely at demographics, contrasting regions with rapidly aging populations against those with booming youth cohorts, and what that means for future labor and innovation.
He looks at the brutal, undeniable politics of food, fertilizer, and resource scarcity.
And technology. He looks at AI imperatives and technological dominance. In a multiplex world, controlling the data servers and the grain shipments might be vastly more powerful than controlling a fleet of ships.
Those metrics are vital. But as we synthesize this, we do have to critically examine his stance as well. We have to ask if Zerbe might be underestimating the sheer, stubborn resilience of the liberal international order.
That's a great point, because it hasn't totally collapsed.
No, it hasn't. He focuses heavily on its failures and its unraveling, but institutions, financial systems, and diplomatic norms that have been deeply entrenched for 80 years do not just evaporate overnight.
Right.
There is a strong counter-argument to be made that the old order is persisting simply because there isn't a unified, viable alternative to replace it yet. The BRICS plus nations might be brilliantly multi-aligned, but they haven't presented a cohesive, global architectural blueprint of their own.
They're navigating the multiplex, but they aren't necessarily building a new unified system.
Exactly.
That tension, the reality that the old system is failing but the new system isn't quite built yet, brings us perfectly to Zerbe's analysis of the United Nations. In late 2025, he released an analysis regarding the UN's 80th anniversary. And if you just look at the headlines, it paints a very grim picture.
Very grim.
The Security Council, which is theoretically supposed to be the ultimate arbiter of global peace, is effectively paralyzed. It is totally deadlocked by the veto powers of legacy nations whose interests are fundamentally opposed. They can't agree on how to stop conflicts, so they just do nothing.
It is absolutely deadlocked on security. The political theater is frozen. But Zerbe counters that surface-level paralysis with what he calls his global lifeline theory. And this is a profound insight.
Okay, tell us about that.
He argues that while the headline-grabbing Security Council is completely frozen, the UN's hidden strengths are actually what is holding the world of 2026 together. We are talking about the technical, bureaucratic layers of the UN.
The unglamorous stuff.
Exactly, the unglamorous plumbing of global governance. The bodies coordinating global pandemic early warning data, managing international aviation standards so planes don't crash into each other, negotiating baseline climate action, and facilitating emergency agricultural aid.
So the day-to-day operations.
Right. These are the invisible threads sustaining the international system. If those agencies stop working, global trade and travel would halt in days. So while the political theater at the top is broken, the plumbing of global governance is still flowing.
And recognizing that distinction is crucial for understanding how a multiplex world actually functions without falling into total anarchy. Okay, so bringing all these threads together, what does this all mean for you, the listener? How do we synthesize all of this academic theory into something practical? The closing hook from our source material puts it brilliantly, quoting the old concept of the interregnum.
That's a powerful quote.
It says, if Noah Zerbe is right, the old world of 1945 is dead, but the new one hasn't been born yet. We're living right in the middle of that gap. The old unipolar order is fading into history, but the new multiplex order is still fiercely figuring out its own boundaries.
And the stakes for the next decade within this interregnum are truly monumental. The decisions made right now, the alliances formed, the rule books written for climate and AI, they will determine the foundational rules of the road for the rest of the century.
That is exactly why we wanted to bring you this deep dive. Having this multiplex framework in your mental toolkit is going to completely change how you consume information.
It really will.
When you read tomorrow's news, it won't just feel like a random, depressing series of chaotic disasters happening for no reason. Instead, you will be able to see it for what it is, a highly complex, multiplayer chess game unfolding in real time.
You'll see the board clearly.
Yes. You will see nations making strategic, multi-aligned moves to protect their interests. You will see the different rule books for climate and security at play in different theaters. And you will see the hidden lifelines keeping the board intact, even when the politicians are deadlocked.
As we leave you today, I want to offer a final provocative thought to mull over. Something building directly on everything we've discussed about Zerbe's non-traditional metrics for the future.
Okay, what is it?
We talked about demographics, food, and technology. Well, if the true power in a multiplex world is no longer strictly dictated by military might, but by the necessity of climate coordination and the absolute imperative of artificial intelligence, what happens to the concept of the nation-state itself?
Oh, wow.
Right. Could the true centers of power in the next decade cease to be traditional countries at all and instead become borderless tech ecosystems or massive global resource conglomerates that operate entirely outside the traditional map?
That is a wild thought to end on.
It is something to consider as you watch the multiplex world continue to evolve.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Keep questioning the map, and we will see you next time.